Okay, Kinan Azmeh, it's a real pleasure to be talking with you. You're in New York, I believe, and I'm here in Prague.
Yes, thank you very much, Jeremy, for having me. Thank you.
So I've got lots and lots of questions I want to ask. And the first one is about your musical background. So I believe that you grew up in Damascus and you started to learn the clarinet there, is that right?
Yes, was born and raised in Damascus. Started playing the clarinet at age maybe 7. Actually, I started first on the violin, but then that didn't go very well, and I switched to clarinet at age 7. And I went to the conservatory as a young boy. And then after finishing from high school, I went to the Higher Institute of Music in Damascus, and I doubled also on electrical engineering. Now I always say that my hobby is electrical engineering because the information I have now is totally irrelevant. I'm like an electrical engineering historian, basically, because the technology changed so much that what I know now is totally irrelevant. And then I moved to the US when I was 24. This is in 2000, actually the year 2000 is when I came to the US.
But your training in Damascus, was it in Western classical music?
It was. Also, it depends on how you look at the word training. My formal training at the conservatory in Damascus was the Western classical repertoire. I mean, I use the word Western classical repertoire, but I don't fully agree with the term because I grew up playing that music, and for me, it was music. I never learned these divisions between what's West and East until later on. Until later on, when it was time to reject the words. But of course, I learned the repertoire: Brahms, Bach, Mozart, and Beethoven. But this is the formal training. But I grew up in a city like Damascus, where you're surrounded by other types of music. In a city like Damascus, you will hear Arabic music, obviously, but also Armenian music, Kurdish music, ancient Syriac music. You hear that in the surrounding. And I grew up in a household where we had lots of influences musically. My dad loves Western classical music. My mom was more into Arabic music. And we had everything in between. We had a big collection at home of LPs that my parents used to collect, which has anything from classical music to rock and roll to jazz and into Arabic music. So that cross-cultural or pan-cultural, if you want, influences were there in my upbringing, not necessarily in the musical education. But when I was studying at the Higher Institute of Music in Damascus, majoring in clarinet performance, I think in the first 3 years of our studies, we had to study Arabic music theory and history. But it's interesting now that I look back at it retrospectively. I didn't take these subjects seriously back then. I was more interested in playing my concerti and joining the orchestra, etc. And I was more interested in improvising at that age rather than studying the music of my home country. I think it's the classic case of you visiting the museum of your hometown only when you leave that hometown. And it's only after I moved to the US where I started digging more into the music, the Arabic music of my, of Syria and of the neighboring countries.
When I was doing little bits of reading in ethnomusicology, long time ago, I was always very interested in how Western ethnomusicologists would describe the music in other cultures, and they often use the word improvisation to refer to what other cultures are doing. And then I also wondered whether these words actually exist in all of these other cultures. And for the musicians who are playing maybe traditional Syrian music, is there this binary opposition between performing music and improvising music?
I mean, this is a great point. I think that you made the point already within the question. Music in many parts of the world, certainly in the Arab world, you are, as a musician, like you cannot be only somebody who plays other music. Like you have to improvise at points. You are actually it's given that you improvise and you perform and you maybe write your own music too. This is part of the same coin all the time as an active musician.
Mm.
Uh, if you're playing in like the oud or kanun or ney in a traditional takht shar'i, which is the traditional Arabic music ensemble, improvisation is part of the job. You can, and lots of the music that is transmitted orally, uh, improvisation is almost built in. Melodies do change shape and speed, and ornaments change depending on the player. And that's why lots of the people that we know now as composers from the Arab world, most of them, if not all, were people who played instruments and were famous as performers and also famous as improvisers. So I think this is something that I believe in personally, that composition and improvisation are actually the same side of the same coin in a way. And in back home, I mean that this similarity is actually even more apparent in the music scene. People are like you cannot go to a gig as a musician in a traditional Arabic ensemble where you say, well, I'm sorry guys, I don't improvise, because lots of the musical vocabulary itself is based on that. The whole system of maqam is not the way people try to portray it now, like, oh, it's a system of scales and modes. It's not that. It's actually how you create life out of a sequence of notes, and how do you use this. So you are composing on the fly, you're improvising on the fly, and when you do that, that's how you systemize the what is existing, and for me, this is actually the most important. And now when I try to teach musicians actually how to improvise, I always try to bring these examples you mentioned as being very important in uh, in a whole and good education. Now I think what happened in music, academia, is that, oh, you have to do only one thing. And I think you can draw a comparison between music in the Arab world, traditional music that is, and Mozart, who was an improviser as well. And somehow things were separated in academia more and more so.
When you were improvising as a child, what was your improvising like, or what was it based on, or what were your influences?
I mean, you're gonna like this. There are three main things that happened in my life that brought improvisation to the forefront. One of them, when I was, maybe 10 years old. Sorry, you might find these stories not related, but I think they're really within the same avenue. When I was around 10, my dad was on a trip to England. And then he came back and he brought with him a little mini computer. It's called ZX Spectrum. Sinclair, I think, is the maker.
I remember.
I mean, it's crazy. The memory that this device had was 48 kilobytes. And you used to like upload programs using cassettes. Anyway, long story short. And we told him like, okay, so what is this for? And he said, I want you guys to learn how to program. I'm like, okay, great. I mean, we didn't know what that meant. But we started taking lessons of how to program with BASIC. And what he said then, which made sense maybe 20 years later for us, he told us, my sister and I, he said, in your time, you will have to choose between being programmers or being programmed. And that thought is like, he wanted us to be part of the creative process. And I think the equivalent of that in music making, he encouraged us also to improvise and to compose at very early age. He wants us to be part of the programmers side rather than just being programmed. So this is one moment that is very clear in my head about what urged me to compose or to create. Another one was when I was 16. This is later on in life. I was in a music camp in New Hampshire. I won the scholarship to study chamber music in this summer camp called the Apple Hill Center for Chamber Music. and I was playing Mozart Clarinet Quintet and I think Irving Fine Woodwind Quintet, and this horn player in the group came to me once and she said, the local public library has a concert series for kids. Do you want to go and play? And I said, yes, I would love to do it, but I don't know what repertoire there is for French horn and clarinet. She said, oh, never mind, we'll improvise. And I remembered that word, but I'd never done it really, like in public. I used to improvise on my own, and I said, like, sure. I mean, I was adventurous, like, okay, let's do it. I had no idea what you mean, but let's do it. And in the car, just before we get to this library, I started to freak out a little bit. So I asked her, so, okay, so what do we do really? And her answer was brilliant. She said, oh, it's going to be very simple. You play a note, I play another note. And this is the only instruction I had. And we went and we played for half an hour just using that.
Mm.
And I think, moving on, like forward, bunch of years after that, when you and I played in Prague a couple of years ago, I think also this is what we did. You play and you listen and then you respond. Like it's basic, and this is one of the first times I did it when to improvise with somebody else. It's hard to know exactly. I think when was it the first time you actually improvise, because I'm sure all of us, people who are trained classically, when you're learning repertoire, I'm sure your brain sometimes takes like a side road, and you're trying to learn a lick or something, or like a hard part in the piece.
Mm.
I'm sure your fingers just start to do something else just by themselves. And maybe this is actually the early seed of improvisation, is when you get bored of the repertoire, you want to try something else, to break a pattern. Improvisation took a more of a serious turn for me at this little gig we did in New Hampshire, because it was incredibly rewarding. Like I was incredibly fulfilled,
Mm.
and it just made me super happy, and it's really addictive. And I waited a few years, and then I started my band, which the whole idea was how we bring short one-line musical ideas, and we make these into pieces.
Mm.
And that was how one of my first band, Hiwar is the name of the band, how it began. 4 people bringing very short, not even one line motifs, and we create pieces out of that.
Mm.
And now maybe 90% of what I do on stage is improvised.
Mm.
Sorry, that's a long answer to your question.
This is a bit of a detour, but I just wanted to ask you about the clarinet and what is so special about the clarinet for you.
The thing, the most special is I know how to use it. I mean, this is the very practical Kinan speaking, because I'm sure if you talk to anybody else, they have a bias towards the instrument they can use. I think with the clarinet, I make the connection between what's in my brain and what I wanted to express the fastest.
Mm.
Because if one has to explain what do we do as artists, or what do you need to be an artist, you always need 3 things. I find one of them is you need to have an idea you want to communicate. Number 2, you need to have a tool to do that. In my case, it's a clarinet. In your case, the flute. And third, you have to have the skills to use the tool to say what you want to say. So in my case, the clarinet fills all 3. I do think I have something to say, and I'm able to use the clarinet to make it dedicated to expressing the idea.
Mm.
But now, again, from that very biased perspective, the clarinet is an instrument that is very flexible. I do think all instruments can be flexible, but the clarinet, historically, you can find it in lots of different musical styles and genres. You find it in East European music. You You find it in Azerbaijan and Armenia. You find it in the American jazz. You find it in like Turkish traditional music and in Western classical music. So it's a very flexible instrument, historically speaking. But also, I think its similarity both in register and in volume is very similar to the human voice.
Hmm.
But I'm sure also every other instrumentalist will say the same. But I do like that. I do like the fact that my voice and the clarinet sound are kind of similar, and in I do think that I can express myself better with the instrument than talking to people. So, but again, from a very practical perspective, it's the instrument that I know how to use to produce the sounds I produce.
I've got a question about your improvising and recording, and I'm sure you listen back to your recordings, and you must enjoy some improvising more than others. And what I really want to get a sense of is what is it that you love about some of the moments in your playing? What are you trying to do, and what are the best moments for you?
This is a wonderful, wonderful question, because it's something that I've been processing for many, many years, especially when it comes to actual recording. It's hard to tell, really, Jeremy. Sometimes you are in a live session, a live concert situation, sorry, and this concert is captured. While you think like, I played wonderfully in the concert, right after the concert, you were very happy. When you listen to the recording, you're like, it could have been better. But then you wait a couple of years and you listen to it again, like, wow, who's that? It sounds great. Who's that person? And then you realize it was you. So I think it's a love-hate situation, a love-hate relationship with the recorded medium. Every time I record something, I'm always amazed by how different the live situation is from a studio album. The live has more risk-taking, and sometimes not in a positive direction. Sometimes maybe you find yourself playing to impress an audience, which ends up being like, like you become an acrobat and you don't want to do that. The things that the music that represents my playing the most, I think, is playing slow and soft. I think this is closest to who I am. But also sometimes I enjoy when I go wild in a concert and I take risks and I do things that I've never done before. These are something that I personally like, but it's not necessarily that people who are listening to it would enjoy. There's always, I think, the challenge of figuring out who is you versus who you think you are. And this is a great quote that I learned recently. I was doing this project with the NDR Big Band, which is this German wonderful big band based in Hamburg. And we recorded a full album of my works, arranged for big band and me as soloist. And everybody in the band, of course, the band member, but all of them are wonderful improvisers. And I was having this conversation with one of the trumpeters of the group. And I was telling him, like, yeah, man, like we recorded, I'm not sure these solos of mine are great. I might just go back to New York after we finish the recording session and do overdubs, because I'm not a great fan of how I played. And of course, I go back to New York a few weeks later and I re-record stuff and I sleep on it for a while. A month later, I listen, and of course, all the overdubs that I did in New York would not work. They sounded awful because I was very, careful, while the original takes were the ones that I ended up using. And the line that he said during this conversation when we were in Hamburg, he said, Kinan, all the solos you like right away after a recording session are solos that remind you of somebody you admire. And the solos you hate are usually, that's your sound. That's the actual you. And for me, it opened a big window in my thinking. Now, when I listen to myself, my recorded self, does it remind me? I ask myself, does it remind me of somebody, or is this me trying to develop my own vocabulary, and this is the next step? And it's something that is worth checking out. I don't have an answer for this, but it's a dynamic relationship. It's affected by time. It's affected with what you're trying to say in a given moment, but also is where you are in your life. Also, are you trying to play for yourself? Are you trying to play for people? I think is another factor.
There are sometimes social situations where I get very, very animated and enthusiastic, and afterwards I think, gosh, I just talked too much, or I was kind of out of character. I must have looked so silly. But then that is a side of me that isn't expressed very often, perhaps, and that's it's a similar kind of idea.
There's I forgot who the actress was, but somebody, actress or singer. Sorry, this example is terrible because I don't remember who it was about. But the somebody said to an actress, I think, why can't you be more, like a director was telling her, like, why can't you be more yourself when you're acting? And she said, well, I act because I don't want to be myself for a while. And I think when we improvise, like, does it have to be always Jeremy all the time, or can you actually change who you are for that given moment and do something that is totally different? And I think when we try to develop our own vocabularies, we do this in private, I think, all the time. Try to learn different musical styles or different techniques sometimes. Most of the time, we lose that courage when we're on stage, and we fall on the default setting where it's like, oh, this has always worked for whatever reason, right? But the moment when we have the courage not to fall back on what we know, most of the time these are the most enjoyable moments. And I think these are the moments that are most worthy of being kept on a recorded medium. It's funny because now you're asking me these questions. Sorry to interrupt you, but I'm realizing things just based on this conversation. Like, yeah, this is where I would like to be, because I'm working now on this new album. And thinking about that helps. So thank you.
Well, and it's making me think about how I practice, and just like putting different hats on. And I'm just going to try something really, really different and crazy. And instead of always sort of trying to find the pure Jeremy, actually just go off in a different direction and just do something else for 5 minutes.
Right. And if we are able to do this on stage, I mean, it becomes you are expanding your comfort zone to include territories that have been untapped, at least in our own playing, I think.
So when you're improvising and you're in the zone, you're really enjoying yourself, where do your ideas come from? I mean, it's not an answerable question.
It is an answerable question because like every case is unique, obviously. I mean, listening to what other people are doing for me has always been the most inspiring. You can go on stage, if you're playing with somebody else, obviously. You go on stage, of course, you don't have to play. Like, my default setting when I play with somebody is like, I don't play. Like, I wait to see what somebody else has to say. And then, in the hopes that you can latch on something, you can find one word or one musical device that this other person used, so you can develop your own response to it, right? If you're doing on your own, I mean, the opening note is an inspiration, or the opening interval can open a whole wide, varieties of ideas. Let's say, this is for people who are not improvisers. If you go and so you play a C, and then after that you play an E flat. Okay, so you might do the whole thing in a C minor thing, or an A flat major situation, or you can just play on minor thirds as a device, and you can transpose all of these. I like to think a lot in motivic development kind of way when I improvise. And that's what I think the difference between what's improvised and what's composed gets narrower and narrower, because you play, and whatever you played in the first few seconds can inspire a whole solo for like an hour-long concert, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when I talk to composers, friends of mine, usually they say the same about their pieces. I have a friend of mine who says, Kinan, the moment I finish the first 2 bars of a piece, for me in my brain, the piece is done, because everything else comes from these 2 bars.
Mm-hmm.
In the complexity of information that two bars can contain, whether it's the intervals used, the rhythm patterns that are there, you can expand and stretch all of this to make a full piece. And I think improvisation more or less is the same. Whatever you play in the beginning can lead you into lots of places. Of course, there are the beaten path in improvisation, and there are always few windows on the sides. And a good improvisation, or an inspired improvisation, is when you check out these side roads, you open these windows that your own playing allowed, and you follow that without knowing how to go back to your original idea.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the time you end up landing safely and you find your way to finish the improvisation. But and these are the ones that I called, inspired.
Mm-hmm. Did you ever practice improvising in any way or study it?
No, not really. It was mostly in like by doing it. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know. I don't know if any of this can be called like. I mean, being on stage is training too. Like I think none of us go on stage thinking like, oh, I've got it all, I know it all, and here it is. You always try, and you miss or you hit, but it doesn't really matter. Training is by doing, and we're lucky in our profession that doing it or training to do it is actually lots of fun. So training is kind of exciting in an improvised situation, because you can be a different Jeremy or a different Kinan every time, and it's great. Some of the training I do, because I'm obsessed rhythmically, I do try to create interesting grooves for myself to solo over, but most of the time these training sessions end up being pieces. Like somehow I'm improvising, and then a melody idea comes, and so I write it down, and here it is. It becomes a piece.
Have you had much experience playing jazz of different kinds? I mean, standards or improvising on harmonic changes?
I have very little, though very, very little. I took few courses in jazz when I was at Juilliard, and also before that when I was at the Boston Conservatory, and I played with a jazz band in Damascus also. I mean, if I know the standard well, yes, I'm comfortable doing that. I mean, if we're doing giant steps in a weird key, no, thank you very much. I love it, and I have so much admiration for people who are able to do that this quickly. What I don't like is where this training becomes, you have just to memorize licks and you combine licks, or you you cut and paste licks, that they would work in a certain progression. That's what I don't like. But I have a recent discovery, like a discovery for my love for blues. Like talk about going back to the basics. And now sometimes I just play along like a 12-bar blues to see how you can do with very little also. For me, this is something that is really interesting. So I don't have any formal training in jazz, even though what I now tour with the most, which is my New York band, has been labeled as like a world jazz band. But I don't consider myself a jazz man by no means.
Do you, when you're playing, do you experience that you're playing what you're singing inside your imagination? Do you feel that you've got an inner melodic voice and you're playing what you hear, or are you sometimes surprised by what you play?
I mean, again, all of these are wonderful questions. I really thank you for this. Yes, actually, maybe most of the time I hear it's hard to really know. It's like the egg or the chicken. It's hard to know that am I able to sing this because I know my fingers can do it, because my fingers have done it before, or is it just some kind of natural connection between you and your instrument? It's hard for me to know. But what I know is lots of the times I try to push myself to sing other things in my head when I play by putting parameters that otherwise I would not have used. For example, like, okay, I want to do this solo for this piece in this program. I want to do it only with my left hand, right? Which basically limits you physically a lot. You have like 5 notes over a 12th interval in the lower octave or the higher octave. And how can you be creative using these kind of parameters? Or I don't want to use my pinkies. Sometimes I think about stuff like that when I play. So it's not exactly a melody that I'm singing, but if I feel stuck, I will impose a new parameter for me to open a new window. So I think it's the opposite of what people think the solution would be. When I'm stuck, I close the space even more for me to find a window, rather than I can do everything. Because the moment where everything is possible, you go back to what you have done before. And I don't know, again, if the singing comes first, like the brain first or the finger first, but I think you get to a point where it's impossible to know, and maybe that's a good place to be at anyway.
Could you say something about the power of silence and repetition in improvising?
Silence. I mean, I'm more into the silence part of the equation. I mean, repetition is great, and I love that. I'm a huge, for example, minimalist music fan, and it's been part of. It was a huge window that opened for me when I started listening to Philip Glass and Steve Reich and all these people when I moved to the US. Music that was largely unknown to me, and I'm a huge electronica, like basic electronica music also. But when I think about that in context of improvisation, for me, repetition is like if there's something I like when I'm playing, and it works, I play it again. But again, like I said, I'm obsessed with rhythm, so lots of the times the things that I repeat have some kind of tension and release relation to the groove that is in the back. Lots of the music I do is groove based also. So repetition comes from that context. Silence, however, especially when I play on my own, I do think of poetry as an inspiring springboard. I like, classic Arabic poetry, for example, when you recite it, but also similar to, I think, most poetry around the world. Let's say you have 2 stanzas of one poetry line. The meaning of the second stanza will not, like the meaning of the first part will not be completed without the second, and they are separated by silence. And this suspension of time, suspension of notes, and how the brain, the listener's brain, can connect over the silence is something that I enjoy. But also when I improvise in front of an audience, I love the tension that is created when you are standing silently instead of in front of a listening audience, where somehow it sounds like it's a very powerful moment to be in front of everybody who are waiting for you to produce sound, but you decide not to because that's what you think works for the moment. I think these are maybe the most meaningful. This is actually answering an earlier question of yours. Some of the most memorable improvisation moments is when I was not playing in a context where I'm supposed to play, where I just decide to take a step back and listen to the audience, listen to the whole, or listen to somebody else playing.
There's something really, I was talking about this the other day in another interview, actually, about the difference between seeing and hearing. And as you say, when there's suddenly silence, you listen even more intently. You don't have to be hearing anything to listen. And there's something very, very powerful that you're so focused, you're so still, you're so patient and just waiting. And there's nothing there. And you can play with that, with sound, of course.
Yeah, and I think also it's within the context. Because that, I mean, I don't want to use the word trick, but any trick can grow old very quickly. Once you have a dramatic silent moment in a huge symphony, right, where the whole orchestra is on silence for this 1 second, that might be the loudest point of the symphony, in a way, right? When everybody's quiet. And I think in improvisation is, if all what you're doing is just silences, then it doesn't work.
Sure.
It's always some kind of relation between what you say and what you don't say. Sometimes I think about it when, two people are meeting for the first time, there's some kind of spark of love, what is not said is usually more important is what's being said. And I would like to treat improvisation like this. You don't have to, a piece you're playing in front of an audience, you don't have to say everything. You don't have to recite all the words you choose the words you say, you wanna share. And the silences represent the ones you don't. And there's a right balance. There's a right percentage, I think, to do this. Of course, depending on the context.
So, listen, Kinan, thank you very, very, very much for talking with me. It's a real pleasure.
Thank you for actually, I love talking about this stuff, especially talking with a dear friend and a wonderful improviser such as yourself.
Thank you.
Because lots of the times we do it and we don't know why we do it. And when you're faced with questions like these, it actually activates the brain even more. So thank you.
No, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. Okay. I hope
so. That was part 1, to be continued.
Yes, to be continued.
See you at part 2.
Okay. Take care.
All right.
Thank you so much, Kinan.
Of course. Pleasure.
Bye.
Bye.